Hey everyone, I'm Kim and welcome back to Crime Stats Daily. This is a channel where we go beyond the headlines to examine the facts, the statistics, and the stories behind crime in America. Our goal is simple: to separate myth from reality using reliable data and credible research. If you enjoy fact-based crime analysis, hit that subscribe button. Join me here each week as we delve into the numbers behind the crime. Now let's get started. I wanted to take an opportunity today to talk about a case that's been in the headlines off and on for the last 30 years, and that is Tupac Shakur. Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas on September the 7th of 1996. He was 25 years old. Now, 6 days later, he died from his injuries. Before we get into the investigation, I want to take a moment to remember who Tupac Shakur actually was. Because when you hear about this case almost 30 years later, it's easy to forget that Tupac wasn't just a name on a police report. He was 25 years old. He was a rapper, but he was also a poet and an actor. He wrote about poverty, racism, police brutality, love, anger, and the contradictions of growing up in America. He could be intensely confrontational, and he could also be remarkably vulnerable. He was complicated. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't a saint. And he certainly wasn't just the image that the media sometimes created around him. Whatever you think about Tupac Shakur, one thing is undeniable: he had an enormous amount of life left to live. That's what makes this case so compelling nearly 30 years later, because we're not just talking about an unsolved homicide. We're talking about a 25-year-old young man whose life was cut short, and a case that took 27 years to produce an arrest. Now, for almost 3 decades, no one was charged in connection with his killing. And then on September 29th of 2023, Duane Keffe D. Davis was arrested and charged with murder. And this week, nearly 30 years after Tupac's death, Davis is finally on trial in Las Vegas. David has pleaded not guilty. He is accused of orchestrating the shooting, but he is not accused of being the person who actually pulled the trigger. And that distinction is important, because today's episode isn't about deciding whether Duane Davis is guilty. That is the jury's job. Instead, I want to answer a very specific question. Why did it take 27 years to make an arrest? Because here's what makes this case so fascinating. This wasn't a case where investigators had absolutely no idea who was connected to the shooting. Investigators were looking at people connected to the case very early. So what happened? Why did the investigation go nowhere for so long? What finally changed? Now, to understand the delay, we must go back to the beginning. Earlier that night, Tupac and members of his entourage were at the MGM Grand after the Mike Tyson fight. There was a confrontation involving Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, a member of the Southside Compton Crips. Video of that confrontation has now been shown to jurors in the current trial. Prosecutors say that confrontation provided the motive for the later shooting. They allege that Davis organized a retaliatory attack. Davis has pleaded not guilty. Now, again, those allegations have not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt at this particular point in time, because the trial is just getting started. Later that night, Tupac was riding in a BMW driven by Death Row Records co-founder Marion Suge Knight. A white Cadillac pulled alongside them. Gunfire erupted. Tupac was struck multiple times. Knight survived, but Tupac died 6 days later. That much is not in dispute. The mystery of what happened is really next. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. By early 1997, Las Vegas homicide detectives had narrowed their investigation down to 3 Los Angeles men, including Orlando Anderson. Anderson was already known to investigators because of the fight at the MGM Grand. He was questioned by police. Investigators said they just didn't have enough evidence to charge him with Tupac's murder. And then there was another major problem: witness cooperation. The Los Angeles Times reported at the time that people in Tupac's entourage were refusing to cooperate with investigators. And that's an important distinction. The problem wasn't necessarily that nobody knew anything, because I think they did. The problem was whether investigators could get people to provide provide evidence that could support a criminal case. And that's very different. It's one of the first major pieces of the puzzle in understanding why this case went cold. Now, by the late 1990s, the investigation simply stalled. Then something else happened that would become enormously important years later. People connected to the suspected shooting began disappearing from the picture. Orlando Anderson was killed in an unrelated shooting in 1998. Other people prosecutors now identify as being involved in the Cadillac are also dead. That matters because a homicide investigation often depends heavily on people, witnesses, suspects, informants, people who were there. So the years pass, those people can become unavailable. So by the time investigators eventually brought a case against Davis, some of the people they might have questioned or charged were no longer alive. The passage of time wasn't just a number. It changed the evidence available to investigators. Now we get to the most important part of the story. Duane Davis. Davis was not a completely unknown figure who suddenly appeared in 2023. He had been on investigators' radar. In 2008, while investigators were looking into the murder of another major rapper, the notorious Big, Davis gave Davis gave information to investigators about Tupac's killing. There was a major legal complication. Davis was interviewed under a proffer arrangement. And in simple terms, he was given protection concerning what he told investigators. So even though he was talking about the crime, that did not automatically mean prosecutors could simply use everything he said to charge him with Tupac's murder. That distinction became extremely important decades later. Now, Davis started talking publicly, and he appeared in interviews. He discussed the Tupac shooting, and in 2019, he co-authored the memoir, Compton Street Legend. In that book, Davis described himself as being in the white Cadillac during the shooting and described providing the gun. Those statements became enormously important. But there's another side to this. Davis's defense argues that his stories were exaggerated for money and for notoriety, for attention. Davis now denies responsibility for Tupac's murder, and he has pleaded not guilty. So we have to be very careful here. We're not saying that Davis has confessed, therefore he's guilty. We're saying Davis made public statements that investigators and prosecutors later used to revive the case. That is documented. Now, in July of 2023, Las Vegas police searched Davis's home. Investigators seized electronic devices, documents, photographs, and other materials. 2 months later, on September 29th, Davis was arrested. And that was the first arrest ever made in connection with Tupac Shakur's killing. Think about that, 27 years from September of 1996 to September of 2023. 27 years between the murder and the first arrest. And according to Las Vegas authorities, Davis's own public statements had helped breathe new life into the investigation. The Los Angeles Times reported that authorities believed his omissions provided the break needed to move the case forward. Now, after looking at the documented history, can we answer our original question? Why did it take 27 years? And if you've watched any of my previous episodes, I've reported on many cases that have gone cold and unsolved for decades. And there's many reasons for that. There isn't one single answer. It's more like a 5-piece puzzle in this particular case. So first, investigators lacked enough evidence to make an arrest in the original investigation. Second, witness cooperation was a major problem. Third, time changed the investigation. People who may have had information died, memories faded, potential witnesses became harder to locate or less willing to participate. Fourth, there were legal complications surrounding Davis's earlier statements to investigators. His 2008 interview was conducted under a proffer agreement, and the admissibility of those statements has been heavily litigated. In fact, just this year, the judge ruled that Davis's 2008 and 2009 statements could be used at trial, while also acknowledging concerns about the protections Davis had been given at the time. The judge separately allowed prosecutors to use his 2019 memoir. And fifth, Davis kept talking. His later public statements provided investigators with information they could pursue outside the protection surrounding those earlier interviews. That combination appears to have been what finally moved this case from a decades-old unsolved homicide to an indictment. Now, there's one reason, there's one more part of our question. Why did it take almost another 3 years to actually get Davis on trial? And that's a different question. Once Davis was arrested in 2023, there was no longer just an investigation. It became a criminal prosecution. There were defense motions. There were disputes over evidence. There were questions about Davis's statements. There were arguments over his memoir. And there were questions about whether those earlier police interviews could be used. The defense also argued that the case was based too heavily on statements that were made decades after the shooting. And those issues had to be litigated before the trial could actually proceed. Now, a judge ultimately ruled that the important parts of the prosecution's evidence could be presented to the jury. And in August of 2026, this trial has finally begun. Now, here's the bottom line about this case. It took 27 years to make an arrest in the Tupac Shakur homicide. The reason isn't simple. The police didn't forget about the case. The investigation identified suspects early on, but investigators faced enormous problems with evidence and witness cooperation. The years that followed changed the people and the evidence surrounding the case. Eventually, one of the people investigators had been interested in became one of the most important sources of investigation, one of the most important sources of information about the crime himself. Duane Davis talked. He talked to investigators. He talked publicly, and he published a memoir. Those statements helped revive an investigation that had been dormant for years. But now comes the part that matters the most. The arrest is not a conviction. Davis has pleaded not guilty. The prosecution has presented its theory, and the defense disputes this and challenges the reliability of the evidence. Now a jury has the case, and as I'm recording this, the trial is underway, as I mentioned earlier. If you are interested in following the trial, if you aren't already, Court TV is providing live coverage from Las Vegas with a dedicated live stream. CNN is also providing live coverage with streaming on their apps. And I believe ABC is also streaming coverage as well. And as I'm recording this episode, one of the things that have happened in the trial is very revealing. Something particularly interesting is that one of the original questions about why this case took so long is one witness has reportedly been openly reluctant to implicate Davis, which demonstrates why witness cooperation remains an issue nearly 30 years later, and why it is oftentimes, although not always, an issue with cold cases, as you've heard me talk about before. This is a fascinating case. It took 27 years to get an arrest, and now 30 years later, the trial is underway. This is Crime Stats Daily. That's the stats for today. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.